It's a it's a great pleasure to be with you tonight. I was this talk I wanted to talk with you tonight is called Costly Obedience, and it's the name of a book that I have been working on. It just was coming out this month with co-author Olya Zaporizets and co-director of our institute that we direct at Regent. And the reason I wanted to write this book called Costly Obedience was really to thank you for the ways in which you say no to something every day to say yes to something else has been a source of great encouragement to me as a Christian. And many things that I deal with in life, I get a pass, and you don't. And so there's something that comes from that over time that builds a certain kind of Christian character. And I know none of us is doing that perfectly, but I know that when you're on that path of gratitude towards God and you're sort of living this kind of faithfulness before God, I guess I just wanted you to know it can be such a source of encouragement to others in the body of Christ. And I just wanted to thank you. So someone, I don't know if it was a book review, but someone once said about me, they said, he explains sexual minorities to evangelicals. And I thought to myself, well, maybe that's what I do. I don't know. I never really thought of it that way, but I have listened. I have logged a lot of hours listening to people, and maybe from time to time I share some of what I've heard with people that it might be harder for some of you to have an audience. And flip that around, there's people that you share with that I could never have an audience with. Let me see if these slides, so this idea of costly obedience is, it's actually been a line of research with 4 different studies. The first is actually of seminary graduates who are now, most of them, lead pastors. And we wanted to ask them about their experiences with LGBTQ people and their church context for sort of the climate and how well prepared they were to really engage around this topic and to shepherd people navigating this space. So that's featured there. A second study, that's the one I'm going to talk more about tonight, is of 300 celibate gay Christians and what their life has been like on different measures. And then a smaller study where we interviewed a number of people, and most of the quotes I'll share tonight are from that. And then the final one is the one I think is the most kind of interesting. I think it was my colleague, Olya, I think she suggested this, but we interviewed friends who function as family to celibate gay Christians. It was such an interesting angle of entry. We had never thought to talk to people who become family to you and what that has been for them, right? So that's a part of this. But let me back up. The study of seminary graduates stood out to me. How often pastors and people navigating same-sex sexuality are speaking past one another. Just often ill-equipped, I think, to many pastors to engage in this area. And I can't imagine how difficult that is for you. I was thinking about this recently when I read a book last year by Henry Nouwen. So this should come up, And I loved this book. It was a series of letters that he had written on the spiritual life that were edited and released. But one of the letters was from a friend who wrote to him about how he wasn't taking the correct approach to healing himself. And now, and he never described himself really as a gay Christian or a celibate gay Christian, but I was struck by the fact that he was criticized by fellow Christians for his decision to live a celibate Christian life while continuing to struggle with unremitting same-sex attractions. And people who were attacking him, this woman who was attacking him, wanted to hear a testimony of healing. And they had in their mind, healing would look a certain way. That the desires would be replaced by heterosexual desire, placing the responsibility back on the person who's experiencing same-sex sexuality. And I was struck by Nouwen's charity towards this person. He writes, your statement that my vision of God is askew, that the emotional imagery of my heart is also askew, and I simply need to become available for healing, feels really quite distant and makes me feel somewhat condemned. It simply sounded like, there must be other healing available to you. Why don't you get your act together and accept the healing that's there for you? If you had any idea of what I've been struggling with over the past 8 months and how I have been trying to really enter into the furnace of God's love and give up everything else in order to really let God heal me, you probably never would have written those words. I know that you don't want to hurt me and that you do care for me, so I hope that you also can be patient and trust that God will do his work when his time comes. It quite easily might take another 10 or 20 years until the deepest wounds in me are healed. It might even be that God wants to teach me how to live with them as a way to participate in the suffering of Jesus. I really don't know, but healing or no healing, I trust that God is greater than my heart and that he desires to show me his love. Friends, this was... Hey, you give it up to Henry Nouwen. You clap for Henry Nouwen. I see you. Look, what a gracious reply. What a patient reply. But it was out of a relationship with a person he knew and loved. I can't even imagine how hard it is for you when there's no relationship and when the letters or emails or tweets are antagonistic and anything but coming from a place of care and trust, or sometimes framed as though they were out of care and trust, but they're antagonistic. Social media can amplify the worst elements of the human condition, including exactly this exchange we just saw between people who don't even love one another, but claim the name of Christ. So let me share a little bit about this project. We thought we knew what celibacy was, and then we invited people to tell us what their story was, and we found that people shared, I'm participating in your study as a celibate gay Christian. And we found that they clustered into 3 groups. What I would have thought of as celibacy, which was celibate from all relationships and no intention of entering into anything, and that was 22% of our sample. And then another percentage, 56, were celibate, but they were open to a relationship with someone of the opposite sex. I thought, that's interesting. I didn't see that coming. And then another group said, I'm celibate, we're celibate from same-sex relationships, but we're in a relationship, in a mixed orientation marriage with someone who's heterosexual. So researchers have to decide all the time whether what we think counts, or whether we're going to listen to the people who are participating and say, okay, you tell us. And so we went with you tell us. And we organized a lot of our findings in this way, and I'll share some of them with you as I go. Our samples, like so many samples, honestly, of LGBTQ research, I would say most were men. Most were Caucasian. Most were Protestant. The average age was 34, which surprised me, and I thought, oh, goodness. We'll be criticized because people will say, well, how do they know about celibate? Don't they need to be 45 or 55 or 65? And then I thought, well, gosh, if they were 65, they would have been raised in an era of an ex-gay narrative that would have probably been a very different story than an average age of 34. That there wouldn't have been the kind of language and categories and meaning-making structures that have really emerged even in the last generation. And so maybe it was good that they were a younger sample. So I've come to terms with that. Of course, they were side B in the language that's used today. When we asked about same-sex behavior, 90% viewed such behavior as morally impermissible, and 86% did not believe that monogamous sexual relationships between those of the same gender would be blessed. There was greater diversity of thought about same-sex attractions, and I know this gets a lot of ink or whatever happens in social media. That's not ink anymore, but that's something. 65% thought that being attracted to members of the same sex is morally acceptable. So 35% would disagree with that. And then it was kind of interesting. It broke down by those celibacy types. So for 83%, the ones who were celibate from all relationships, 83% thought that their same-sex sexuality was acceptable. And it dropped a little bit to 63% if they were open to an opposite-sex relationship, and it dropped even more to 55% if they were in a mixed orientation marriage. And it's interesting. I don't have any real, my thought is that I think people kind of navigate those questions of what those things mean, but there's diversity of thought within your own community, and some of those, there may be really thoughtful reasons why that is, and it would be worth kind of unpacking that further. After we had asked pastors about their equipped and their sense of being ready to minister effectively to the LGBTQ community, I'm not sharing much about that right now, but my now end quote was capturing what I thought there. But we asked the celibate gay Christians what their experience with the church was. And these were the 5 main areas that they clustered around. The expectation of change. Church talk, meaning it wasn't ever talked about, or sins are not treated equally, or there's this atmosphere of fear around this. It was kind of clustered under church talk. The question of salvation, guilt by association, and sacramental understanding. So Gene, none of these names are real names. So if you know a Gene or you know other people, it's not the Gene you know. Okay, so let me just say that as a researcher. So Gene shared with us the idea that I'm the one that needs fixing if I'm the one struggling with this. I can't love other people, I can't offer them anything, or I certainly can't serve them in church or care for other people that might be struggling with divorce or a child abusing drugs or simply depression. And there's just kind of this mentality that it's like keeping a person on crutches to say that this isn't healed, this broken leg of yours isn't healed until you're straight. Ben shared about church talk. I have experienced same-sex attraction from a very early age, pretty much as long as I can remember, as early as 6 or 5 years old. And it's amazing to me that I was able to pick up how my attractions were unacceptable. Yet I picked up on these completely unarticulated social cues that this was not normal or acceptable. So from a very early age, I kept it under wraps. Jean said, "That's my biggest problem. It's when people put something about homosexuality up there with a salvation issue. If you're gay, you're not Christian. Or even if you're not acting or behaving or engaging in behavior with somebody of the same sex, it's a lot of times equated with you're not a Christian or somehow a salvation issue." Neil talked about the challenge that you know all too well, guilt by association. It's a unique experience. You're way too conservative for not living into who you're supposed to be for side A Christians generally, and certainly the broader gay culture, but also the straight ally culture that's so much picked up in the gay culture. And then for conservative churches, you're still too far out there. The minute you identify as gay, you're already put in a separate league from the people that are straight. 15% of our sample were Catholic, and Alex said, "I think the thing that helps the most on my faith journey is the sacraments. As a Catholic, I have a very strong sense of sacramental faith, that God uses ordinary things and uses them supernaturally." Over 90% of the people we surveyed did not see this as a choice. This is not willful disobedience. They were saying we found ourselves with our same-sex sexuality, just as heterosexual people find themselves attracted to the opposite sex. Almost 90%, thought there probably was some kind of a push in this direction from biology. And there was greater disagreement about whether environment might be involved as well, kind of layering in another element of causation. Most did not believe a person can change. 82% said, no, I don't think people can change their attractions. And then it did cluster again. 96% who are celibate from all would say, no, I don't think that people can change their attractions. It dropped a little bit to 82% if the person was celibate but open, and then down to 69% if a person was in a mixed orientation marriage. Nearly all, 99%, believed yes, a person can live a celibate life. If you've ever heard me talk about these topics, you've probably heard me talk about milestone events, but milestone events are the way that mainstream LGBTQ researchers study the key events that shape how a person develops and comes to see themselves as a sexual minority or gay or same-sex attracted. And so I've been studying that with Christians and what that journey is like for them. And so you ask adults to look back on their life and identify those key milestone events. I often liken it to navigating difficult terrain, particularly for Christians, after what I just shared about the challenges in the church where it doesn't get talked about, or you pick up really early that you shouldn't talk about it. We've interviewed people who said, I told one person in my church and they said, don't tell anybody about it. And so I didn't for 40 years. It was heartbreaking. And so it's like navigating this difficult terrain. And these are the kinds of milestones that we talk about. First time where this was confusing to you. Often feeling different from your peers for gender-related reasons. And initial same-sex awareness of your same-sex sexuality, typically shortly after puberty. Initial time that I attributed, does this mean that I'm gay? Or some people in this attribute it to the fall. First same-sex behavior. First time I privately thought of myself as gay. I looked at myself in the mirror and I said, I'm gay. First time I disclosed this with somebody else. And first time I shared publicly, this is how I will be known publicly as a gay person. And these are the average ages for the sample of 300 people and the percentages here. Not everyone felt confused, obviously. Most did not engage in sexual behavior. Could I just draw your attention to one thing that is so hard to read? It's the gap between initial awareness of same-sex sexuality between ages 13 and 14 and the average age of disclosure at 21. You're telling me that for 7 or 8 years, on average, people kept this so quiet they didn't tell anybody. Remember, disclosure is the first disclosure you shared. Now, there's plenty of people in this room where that's, you've disclosed much earlier than that. But on average, when you survey 300 people and they tell you, on average, I was aware between ages 13 and 14, and on average, I shared this with the first person when I was 21. That tells me so much about the faith communities that we're a part of and social circles that we're in and the fear. It's a formula for shame. And then, unfortunately, there's people like me and people at leadership in churches who look back and we take no responsibility for creating the very climates that lead you to that formula. It was interesting, the first time we'd ever studied celibate gay Christians, we actually found there were some additional milestones that we didn't see with other studies we'd done. Many wrestled with side X. Charles says, I also saw that orientation change in a way had been an idol for me. It's like worshiping this idea of being a normal Christian, normal being getting married and having kids in the Sunday school, and all those things being that. Eugene said about considering side A was another milestone. I'll be really honest, I really wanted side A to be true. I always wanted that, for same-sex relationship to be something I can pursue. At the same time, I just couldn't find enough explanation for the theology. And I know they say it's biological or whatever. I mean, I get that part. Just the fact that it couldn't convince me to go outside of my values or just my traditional beliefs. Honestly, traditional values can very easily be logically explained away. There were times I wanted to just walk out on side B, but there was never enough evidence on the side A when I really wanted it to be. And then the last milestone was landed on side B. Sebastian says he was interacting with a friend who asked him a question. The question was, if God doesn't change your orientation, will you still serve him? And I said, yeah. I think that's when I began to entertain the notion of, instead of being side X, or for reparative therapy or orientation change or XK or whatever you want to call it, that's when I began to get through and go, okay, maybe there's a separation between my internal experience of temptation and what everyone else was calling don't adopt a gay identity or act on those impulses or anything like that. I think my becoming settled in a sort of a side B mindset. By the way, I don't know if Wesley is in the room, but I could have almost put in reading, washed, and waiting almost became a milestone for people. It was like, it came up so many times in this closet. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. I was like, okay, everybody's reading, wash, and waiting. It was great. It was such a milestone. We had a number of measures of mental health, and this was where I walked on eggshells. I had some fear and trepidation because I know many people for whom this has been a really tough path. And I thought, how will they fare on measures of psychological distress and depression and anxiety and well-being? I'll share just one study. One survey, one measure. There were several, but for the sake of time. This is, it's called the Depression, Anxiety, and Stress Scale. And it covers those three areas. And I was really surprised at the high percentage of celibate gay Christians who were in the normal range for depression. Almost 80% scored in the normal range versus mild depression, which would have been 12%, moderate depression, 8%, and severe depression, 1%. That was stunning. For comparison, major depressive disorder is diagnosed in about 7% of the general population. There's higher prevalence for adults under age 30. And there's not a gauge here for major depression. It's not quite like that, but it's probably, if you combine moderate and severe, 8 and 9%, or 8 and 1%, get about 9%, you'd get close to that. So they're doing kind of what you might see in the general population. Now, when you break out the groups, the group that's celibate from all relationships, they were at a little over 12%. So they were at greater risk. And we did see that throughout our analysis, that group tended to be at greater risk for depression and other areas. And then you had anxiety, 93% fell in the normal range. And then with stress. So this surprised us. Now, other measures had different variations. Some greater vulnerabilities were connected to something else we looked at, which was attachment style, things like that. But overall, we found that our sample were healthier than you might expect, given the complexities of their social relationship relative to both the Christian community and the mainstream LGBTQ community. So when I approached this, I really thought I had this temptation. I don't know if you remember this image, but I was imagining myself needing to sort of, talk about how difficult it was, and and I would be overstating the actual findings, and then I'd see a couple of celibate gay Christians like walking behind me, so I don't know. I don't know. So, obviously we're having a light moment there, but so we know. In all seriousness, this was a very funny thing to watch on YouTube. But the reality is, Hurricane Florence didn't hit there, but Florence did hit. And so even when you don't see the kind of elevations you expected to see in a sample of 300 people, it doesn't mean that there aren't people really hurting. And so we have to walk that carefully, okay, and I realize that. So something that I was surprised by. I think it warrants more study, more understanding, but certainly to prepare pastors and others and Christian leaders and you to serve one another. We want to be sensitive to, while it doesn't affect everybody, there are people for whom there's great vulnerability, right? Let me close with, we ended the book with how celibate gay Christians could positively affect the church. I didn't want to write a book that was about reaching down to celibate gay Christians when I had been helped by so many. I reach across, and I hope that you'll graciously reach across to me. And here's just some examples of what people shared. It's things that you know because you're gifted in these ways. But Charles shared how celibate gay Christians embody a teaching on suffering and grace. He says, I think that the biggest benefit of any story of any Christian who suffers or who has struggles is that suffering isn't actually punishment from God. That suffering is actually often like a grace from God. It's how he brings us closer to him. I think that also the story of gay celibate Christians is maybe just a powerful message to the world that Jesus Christ is enough. Some celibate gay Christians felt they could bring the gift of greater honesty and transparency to the church. God knows we need it. Questions about difficult topics or hardships in life go unasked and unanswered unless someone's willing to say the hard thing, to break the silence and be honest about challenges and doubts. And Desmond said, I have observed that when I share honestly and authentically, people say they get a lot out of it. Exactly why that's the case, I can't completely vouch for. I think maybe it's because I'm honest about things that a lot of other people find uncomfortable or taboo. Not necessarily in terms of my sex life, but more in the sense of being honest about the frustrations and difficulties of trying to follow God. In a lot of Christian circles, it's unacceptable to be honest about that kind of thing, and it can lead to an extremely oppressive atmosphere, and it makes it impossible to be open to yourself or to God about yourself. I'm deeply convinced that no matter how unpleasant it is, honesty is the first necessity of following God, that literally nothing can be done without that, because without that, you're not dealing with family. Alex talked with us about the outward witness to the contemporary culture. He said a major benefit of gay Christian celibacy is being a challenge to society. It's just something that's very radical. The fact that you're not getting married, the fact that you're not having sex, celibacy is a very countercultural thing, living apart and against the grain of culture. Ben talked about humanizing the issue. That somehow I could use my story to be an educational experience for people who really aren't familiar with this, to help them think more individually, more personally, that it's not just about them, but it's an us and us kind of conversation, that it's not us that are better, but it's us here all at the table together. I meet, you do too, I'm sure, I meet too many people for whom the conversation is a topic, it's a concept, it's not a person. And when people can humanize the topic in ways that I can't, it's a gift to the body of Christ. Charles talked about being attuned to the margins. If it hadn't been for this, like this long drawn out experience of suffering and processing suffering and what that's like, I wouldn't have at all been able to relate to marginalized people or people who are really lost and alone in a lifelong battle with sexual identity struggle or crisis. And I just can see, like I see people who struggle with alcoholism or eating disorders and with minorities who feel like their stories are marginalized or erased. I have found that many times it is really my experience of my spirituality that gives me the compassion, and often it gives me some sort of way into the conversation or some sort of way that I can begin to have empathy for people, and I really think it has made me so much softer and compassionate and really given me the heart of Christ. Friends, I mean, you know these things. Attuned to the margin, humanizing the topic, outward witness. These are the very things the body of Christ needs, and you're the very people to bring it. Several years ago, I went through a professional crisis that just brought me to my knees, and my sister wrote to me a letter that I'm going to share just a part of, and I'll close out with this. But she wrote to me, and I think of you when I read her letter. What does it mean to test faith? Trials, troubles, test our faith. Why? Because they cause us to question God's promises. They undermine our confident assurance that those things that we've not yet seen are going to happen. We've not yet seen them, and this awful thing that's happening to me now makes me wonder if I will ever see them. Yet it's at this point that endurance comes into the picture. What is endurance? What is its relationship to faith? If we no longer have confident assurance about things we cannot see, if we're haunted by doubt, or if we're simply so weary or in so much anguish that the things we cannot see become unreal to us, it is endurance that makes us continue on, no matter what. It is, in a sense, a willfully blind obedience to God, a stubborn determination to go on, almost like Jacob wrestling with God and refusing to let go until God blessed him. It's somewhat difficult to reconcile this with James' admonition to consider trials an opportunity for joy, not because of the trial per se, but because of the opportunity to endure. This is an opportunity because it results in strong character, in a Christian who is ready for anything. All of this would seem to imply that a Christian whose faith is never tested would not be much of a Christian at all. In other words, God builds into the Christian life aspects of character development that would not be possible outside of a fallen world. Here, we must face situations in which we're genuinely tempted to throw in the towel, so that we can also have the genuine opportunity to press on. And in pressing on, we gain a victory, even a small victory of faith. And in doing that, we develop our own Christian history, our personal Christian memory, which is an integral part of our individual character. We can see what we've been through and how God brought us through it, and we are all ready to face whatever happens next, not because of ourselves, but because of what God has already done for us and in us. Friends, that has been your testimony to me. You are the very people, when you say no to say yes to something else, time after time after time, you build a certain Christian character that strengthens you and has been a source of encouragement to me and is the very thing needed to strengthen the witness of the church today. Thank you.